I stood at the bus stop in December, watching my breath turn to fog while my arms wrapped uselessly around my school uniform. The wind cut through the thin fabric like it had a personal grudge. I could see Mum's car idling in the parking lot. She'd driven right past me to hand my sister Olivia her forgotten lunch bag. Through the window, I watched Olivia laugh at something Mum said, both of them warm inside that heated bubble of metal and glass. My coat sat folded in the back seat. I'd seen it there when I climbed out that morning. Mum pulled away without looking back. The bus wouldn't come for another 20 minutes. My fingers had already gone numb. It wasn't the first time. Last week, they'd forgotten to pick me up from violin practice. I'd waited until the janitor locked up, then walked home in the rain. The week before that, Dad had missed my parent-teacher conference, the one where Mrs. Rodriguez wanted to discuss my scholarship application. He'd been at Olivia's soccer game instead, the one where she sat on the bench the entire time. I stopped expecting them to remember somewhere around my 14th birthday, the one they'd rescheduled because it conflicted with Olivia's dance recital. We never did reschedule. The cold seeped deeper. I thought about calling, but my phone had died that morning and nobody had noticed when I asked to borrow a charger at breakfast. Olivia had been showing them videos from her TikTok, the one that had gotten 500 likes overnight. Dad had laughed at every single one, that booming laugh he saved for things that genuinely delighted him. Mum had clapped her hands together and suggested they make a family account together. I'd asked about the charger again, softer this time. Olivia had kept scrolling. By the time the bus came, I couldn't feel my feet. The driver gave me a concerned look when I climbed the steps, stumbling slightly. My legs had that wooden quality that comes from standing too still in the cold for too long. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked. I nodded because my jaw was clenched too tight to speak without my teeth chattering. The shivering didn't stop until third period, when Mr. Harrison turned up the classroom heater after I couldn't hold my pencil steady enough to take notes. He didn't say anything, just quietly adjusted the temperature and moved on with the lesson. That small kindness made my throat tight with something that felt dangerously close to tears. I swallowed them down. I'd gotten good at that. That night at dinner, I sat quiet while they discussed Olivia's upcoming winter formal. She needed a new dress, something special. Mum was already planning a shopping trip for Saturday, one of those all-day affairs with lunch at that nice bistro downtown, and probably manicures after. I had a chemistry presentation that same day, the one worth 40% of my grade. I'd mentioned it twice in the past week. "Sienna, you're quiet tonight," Dad said. And I felt that familiar flutter of hope. Maybe he'd noticed. Maybe he'd ask. "Just tired," I said. He nodded, already turning back to Olivia. "So you're thinking blue or green for the dress?" The flutter died. Nobody asked why my lips were still faintly blue, why I'd worn my winter coat all through dinner, why I couldn't seem to get warm no matter how many layers I added. They didn't notice that I'd barely touched my food because my stomach had been in knots since that morning, since watching Mum drive away with my coat in the back seat. I went to bed early, burrowed under every blanket I owned. But the cold had settled somewhere deeper than my bones. It lived in the space where warmth was supposed to come from, the place where family was supposed to sit and stay and notice. I closed my eyes and felt nothing but tired, not the physical kind that sleep could fix, but the soul-deep exhaustion that comes from trying so hard to matter and failing every single time. The collapse happened slowly, then all at once. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't cry or rage or beg them to see me. I simply stopped trying to remind them, stopped hoping they'd remember, stopped taking up space at the dinner table with my needs and wants and achievements that fell into the silence like stones into deep water. I became quiet in the way that furniture is quiet, present but unremarkable, functional but forgettable. The shift happened over weeks, so gradual that nobody noticed. Or maybe they noticed and were relieved. A daughter who didn't ask for rides or attention or help was easier than one who did. I started walking home from school instead of waiting for pickups that never came. I stopped mentioning my grades, even when I got a perfect score on the calculus exam I'd studied for until 2 in the morning. I stopped leaving my schedule on the fridge, stopped asking them to come to events, stopped existing in any way that required their participation. When I stopped talking about my scholarship interview, nobody asked about it. The interview was for a competitive science program, the kind that could change your entire future. I'd been preparing for months, practicing my answers, researching the program until I could recite their mission statement in my sleep. The interview was on a Tuesday at 4 o'clock. I'd mentioned it at least 5 times. Tuesday came. I took the bus downtown by myself, sat in a waiting room full of kids with their parents, and nailed every single question. The interviewer told me I was exactly what they were looking for. I thanked her and took the bus home, where dinner was already over and the kitchen was dark. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter. When I stopped coming to family movie night, nobody saved me a seat. The first Friday I didn't come down, I heard them start the movie without me. The second Friday, I heard Olivia ask if they should wait, and Mum said, "She's probably doing homework. You know how she is." The third Friday, they didn't mention me at all. When I started eating dinner in my room, they just set one less place at the table. I told myself it was more efficient this way. I could study while I ate, maximize my time, focus on the things that actually mattered since family clearly didn't make that list. But efficiency doesn't keep you warm at night. The math teacher called home about my declining grades. It was the first time my grades had ever slipped, and not by much. I'd gone from a 98 average to an 89. Still a B+, still respectable. But the teacher had noticed the pattern. She'd noticed that I'd stopped raising my hand, stopped coming in for extra help, stopped engaging with the material beyond what was minimally required. Dad took the call in the living room while I stood in the hallway waiting to explain that I'd been too cold to concentrate, too tired from walking home in the dark, too hollow to care about logarithms when nobody cared about me. He never called me down. I heard him tell the teacher he'd handle it before hanging up. Then he turned up the TV volume, and that was that. I went back upstairs and stared at my math homework until the numbers blurred together. I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying weeks ago, around the time I realised that tears required witnesses to matter, and I had none. I lasted 3 more weeks. The pneumonia started as a cough I couldn't shake, the kind that rattled in my chest and made my ribs ache. I ignored it the way I'd learned to ignore most things about myself. My hunger, my loneliness, my persistent, pathetic hope that someone might notice I was disappearing. Then came the fever, creeping up slowly until I felt like I was burning and freezing at the same time. The weight on my chest made each breath feel like lifting something heavy. I stayed in bed, assuming someone would eventually notice I hadn't come downstairs for breakfast, for dinner, for anything. On day 1, I heard them leave for Olivia's orthodontist appointment. The front door closed with a cheerful bang, and their voices faded as they walked to the car. Nobody had checked on me. On day 2, Olivia knocked to ask if I'd seen her blue sweater. I tried to answer, but my voice came out as a croak. She must not have heard because she just walked away, her footsteps fading down the hallway. On day 3, Mum cracked the door to say dinner was ready if I wanted any. The light from the hallway hurt my eyes. I managed to say something, maybe not hungry or sick or just a sound that approximated words. She nodded and closed the door. The smell of pot roast lingered after she left, making my empty stomach turn. On day 4, I stopped being able to get up. The room spun when I tried to sit, and my legs wouldn't hold my weight. I made it to the bathroom once, clinging to the wall, and barely made it back to bed. My sheets were soaked with sweat. I kicked them off and immediately regretted it, shivering so hard my teeth clacked. Together. On day 5, I heard them laughing downstairs at some comedy special. The sound travelled up through the vents, warm and alive and not for me. Olivia's distinctive giggle mixed with Dad's deep chuckle and Mum's bright laugh. They sounded happy. They sounded like a family. I wondered if they'd noticed my door hadn't opened in 5 days. On day 6, the fever spiked so high I stopped shivering. I stopped everything. My body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The room got soft around the edges. The ceiling blurred into nothing, and I thought about the bus stop, about standing in the cold, about the coat in the back seat. I thought about how fitting it was that I die the same way I'd lived. Cold, alone, forgotten. The darkness that came wasn't scary. It was gentle, almost kind. It felt like finally being allowed to rest after carrying something heavy for far too long. I let it take me, grateful that at least the cold was finally over. I died the way I'd lived those last few months. Alone, unnoticed, waiting for someone to remember I existed. The darkness was warmer than I expected. Then, it wasn't darkness anymore. It was December, morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains. The same curtains that had hung there since I was 12, the ones with the tiny stars printed on them that I'd picked out at Target. My phone alarm was blaring that annoying song I'd used junior year, the one I'd changed months ago because I'd grown to hate it. I sat up, and my body felt light, strong, clear-lunged, no weight on my chest, no fever, no ache in my bones. I checked the date on my phone. 2 years earlier. I was 16 again, standing at the beginning of the timeline that would lead me to that cold bus stop, that forgotten coat, that slow fade into nothing, that lonely death while my family watched television downstairs. But I remembered everything, every dismissal, every missed moment, every time I'd swallowed my hurt and asked for less and less until I'd asked for nothing at all. I remembered the weight of trying to earn love that should have been free. I remembered dying alone with pot roast smells drifting under my door. I remembered the cold, always the cold, seeping into places warmth should have lived. The rage lasted about 30 seconds. It burned through me like a fever breaking, hot and purifying and ultimately useless. Rage required action, required confrontation, required them to care that I was angry. Then it crystallized into something colder and more useful, clarity. I wasn't going to beg anymore. I wasn't going to compete with Olivia for scraps of attention like a dog under the table, hoping for fallen food. I wasn't going to freeze at bus stops or wait in dark parking lots or sit at dinner tables where nobody saw me. I wasn't going to die alone in my room while they laughed downstairs. I was going to remember myself even if they never did. The first test came that same morning. Mum was rushing around the kitchen, packing Olivia's lunch with the careful attention she brought to everything my sister touched. She cut the crusts off the bread, added a handwritten note on a napkin tucked in Olivia's favourite cookies. I'd always packed my own lunch, had been doing it since middle school when it became clear that remembering 2 lunches was too much for Mum to handle. But that morning I just grabbed an apple and headed for the door. "Sienna, don't you need a lunch?" Mum called after me. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. In the old timeline, I would have said something like, "I've got it," or "I'm fine," or any of the small lies I told to make myself easier to ignore, to make my needs smaller, to pretend I didn't notice the disparity between the lovingly packed lunch and the empty bag. "I assumed you were too busy," I said instead, not unkindly, just factually. "I'll buy something at school." Her face did something complicated, a flicker of surprise and maybe guilt. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but I was already out the door. I heard her call my name again, but I didn't stop. The morning air was cold, but not bitter yet. December hadn't shown its teeth. I walked to the bus stop with my hands in my pockets, and when the bus came, I climbed on with my coat still wrapped around me, warm and visible and mine. At school, I went straight to the guidance counsellor's office instead of homeroom. Mrs. Patterson looked surprised to see me. In the old timeline, I'd waited until senior year to ask for help, too afraid of being a burden, too convinced that wanting more was somehow greedy. "Sienna, is everything okay?" She glanced at her clock. "Shouldn't you be in homeroom?" "I want to talk about early graduation." I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. And scholarship opportunities for spring admission. She blinked, setting down her coffee. You're a junior. I'm ready. Something in my voice must have convinced her because she didn't argue. She puzzled up programs on her computer, made calls to colleagues at other schools, printed applications and requirements. We talked about course credits, about testing requirements, about whether I was really sure I wanted to compress 3 years into 1.5. Why the rush? She finally asked, and her tone was gentle but curious. I thought about dying alone, about standing in the cold, about becoming so invisible that even my death took days to notice. Because I can't breathe here, I said simply. She studied my face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there made her nod. Okay, let's make a plan. By the time I left her office, I had a plan that didn't involve waiting for anyone's permission to want more. I needed to take 2 extra classes in the spring, test out of gym and art, maintain a 3.8 GPA minimum, and score high on the SAT. It was aggressive, maybe borderline impossible. I felt more alive than I had in years. That afternoon, Mum texted asking if I needed a ride home. It was unusual enough that I stared at the message for a full minute. In the old timeline, she'd never asked. I just waited at the bus stop, assuming she'd forgotten, until I'd eventually stopped expecting anything else. I was already on the city bus, heading to the community college to pick up dual enrollment registration forms. I texted back, "Already handled, thanks anyway." She sent back a question mark emoji. I didn't respond. The dinner table that night was the first time they really looked at me. "You're taking college classes?" Dad said, fork halfway to his mouth. He looked genuinely shocked, like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "Starting in January, it'll help me graduate early." Olivia frowned, a little crease appearing between her eyebrows. "Why would you want to graduate early? Don't you want to do senior year stuff? Prom and graduation parties and all that?" I met her eyes calmly, and I saw the exact moment she registered that I was looking at her differently. Not with the desperate sister worship I'd always shown her, not with envy or competition, but with the polite distance you'd give a stranger. "Why wouldn't I?" said. They had no answer for that. I'd stopped playing the game, where I pretended my ambitions needed their approval, where I asked permission to want things, where I made myself small enough to fit into their vision of who I should be. "This seems sudden," Mum said carefully. "Have you thought this through?" "Yes. It's a big decision, honey. Maybe we should talk about it as a family. I've already registered for the placement test," I said, cutting through her building momentum. "They're next week. If I pass, I start in January." The silence that fell was thick and uncomfortable. Dad exchanged a look with Mum, that wordless communication parents do when we're trying to figure out which of them should handle something. "We're just concerned," Dad started. "You're only 16. What? You weren't concerned when I was walking home alone in the rain," I said, my voice still calm, still even. "You weren't concerned when I missed dinner for 3 days straight last month. You weren't concerned when my math teacher called about my grades." Dad's face went red. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Mom made a small sound, almost a gasp. Olivia was staring at her plate. I stood, picking up my half-eaten dinner. "I'm eating in my room. I have studying to do." I left them sitting there in the stents I'd created, and for the first time, it felt like power instead of abandonment. The next few months unfolded like watching a play I'd already seen, except this time I wasn't on stage waiting for my cue. I was in the audience, detached, observing. I knew every beat, every forgotten promise, every dismissal that was coming. But I didn't wait for them anymore. When they forgot my coat at the bus stop in December, the exact same day, the same cold morning, the same moment, I didn't stand there shivering. I watched Mum drive past to give Olivia her lunch, saw my coat in the back seat, and felt nothing but a distant satisfaction that I'd been right about how this would play. I walked directly to the coffee shop 3 blocks away, bought tea with the emergency cash I'd started keeping in my bag, and called a cab. The driver was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who asked if I went to school nearby. For now, I said. The fare came out of the allowance they forgot to give me regularly anyway, so I'd started babysitting for the neighbours. Mrs. Chen paid well and always had snacks ready. She remembered to ask how school was going and actually listened to the answers. It was remarkable how much easier it was to feel seen by strangers than by your own family. I got home before they did. I made myself hot chocolate and wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch, reading a book for my college course. When Mum walked in carrying my coat 45 minutes later, she looked confused to find me warm and comfortable. "You weren't at the bus stop," she said. "No," I agreed, not looking up from my book. "I got cold, so I left." "We were just coming back. I know. I saw you drive past the first time. When you were dropping off Olivia's lunch." The words landed like stones. Mum's face did something complicated, guilt and defensiveness warring for dominance. "Sienna, It's fine," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't angry anymore. You can't be angry at people for being exactly who they've always shown you they are. "Thanks for bringing it home." I held out my hand for the coat. She gave it to me slowly, like she wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words. I took it upstairs, and the coat went into the back of my closet. The next day, I used my babysitting money to buy a new one, a good one, thick and warm, the kind that kept you comfortable even in the worst weather. The kind you bought when you understood that nobody was coming to keep you warm. I wore it every day and never felt cold again. Christmas that year was illuminating. They'd gone all out for Olivia, the way they always did. A new laptop for her photography hobby, the expensive kind with the editing software already installed. There were also clothes, jewellery, a new phone case, art supplies, concert tickets. My pile was smaller. A generic gift card to a bookstore, the kind you buy at the grocery store checkout. A sweater in the wrong size. A set of pens. In the old timeline, I'd smiled and said thank you, and gone to my room to cry into my pillow, wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't worth the same effort. This time, I smiled and said thank you and meant it. The gift card told me everything I needed to know about where I stood, and that information was more valuable than any laptop. It confirmed what I'd already accepted. I was alone in this family, and that was okay, because I'd learned to take care of myself. I used the gift card to buy test prep books for the SAT, studied 6 hours a day over winter break, while they took Olivia on a ski trip I wasn't invited to. They'd mentioned it at dinner one night, discussed lodges and ski rentals, and never once asked if I wanted to come. "We didn't think you would want to," Mom said when I pointed this out, her voice defensive. "You've been so focused on studying." "You're right," I said. "I don't want to go, but you didn't ask." The distinction seemed to escape her. I spent Christmas a week in the empty house, studying in silence, and scored in the 99th percentile on the SAT. Applied to 14 universities, all of them far from home, all of them with strong science programs and full financial aid for students like me. The acceptance letters started coming in March, thick envelopes with congratulations and scholarship offers. I pinned them to my bulletin board, a growing collection of escape routes, and didn't mention them at dinner. I didn't tell them until I'd made my decision. Full ride to a prestigious school 800 miles away, early admission starting summer semester, housing included, meal plan covered, even a stipend for books. I was leaving in 3 months. I told them at dinner on a random Tuesday, sliding the acceptance letter across the table like it was a dinner receipt. "Summer semester," Mum's voice went high and sharp. "But you're only 16. You won't even be 17 until August," I finished. "I'll turn 17 the week before move-in. I checked the housing policies. They have accommodations for younger students." Dad set down his newspaper with enough force to rattle the table. "Sienna, this seems rushed. Don't you want to finish high school with your friends? experience prom, walk at graduation. I thought about the friends I didn't have because I'd been too busy trying to be invisible. The prom I'd never planned to attend because nobody had ever asked me, and I'd learned that going alone just highlighted your loneliness. The graduation ceremony I'd already be walking in, early, on my own terms, without them there to watch, because they'd probably forget anyway. No, I said simply. I don't want any of that. Olivia looked stricken, and for the first time in our lives, I saw real tears in her eyes. But you'll miss my graduation. You'll miss my senior year. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed. She'd missed or dismissed every important moment of my life. My orchestra performances, my academic awards, my 16th birthday, the scholarship interview that had changed my future. And now she wanted me to witness hers. I'll send a card, I said. That's not the same. No, I agreed. It's not. The argument that followed was predictable and useless. They used words like family and too young and think about this carefully. They'd never said those words when I was eating dinner alone in my room, or walking home in the rain, or dying in my bed while they laughed downstairs. They'd never thought I was too young to be invisible, too young to be forgotten, too young to handle complete emotional neglect. But now that I wanted to leave, suddenly I needed guidance. Suddenly I was their daughter who required their input. I listened with the patience of someone who'd already died once. Their concern now was just noise. The sound of people realizing too late that they'd lost something they'd never bothered to hold on to. I've already accepted, I said when they wound down, when they'd run out of arguments that might have mattered 2 years ago. The deposit is paid. I'm going. With what money? Dad demanded, and his face was red again. That blotchy colour he got when he was truly angry. Mine. What money could you possibly have? The birthday checks from Grandma you forgot to give me for 3 years. I found them in the junk drawer last year. I kept my voice steady, factual. The allowance you skipped 17 times but never made up. The babysitting money from Mrs. Chen and the Roberts family. The prize money from the science fair you didn't come to. The scholarship money from the essay contest you didn't know I entered. Each item landed like a slap. Mum's face had gone pale. Olivia was crying openly now, not delicate tears but big gulping sobs. It adds up, I continued, when you're not expecting anyone to take care of you, when you learn early that you're on your own. The silence that fell was the kind that happens when people realize they're strangers to each other, when the illusion of family shatters and reveals the empty space underneath. We're your parents, Mum said finally, and she sounded lost, her voice small in a way I'd never heard before. We're supposed to help you with things like this, with college applications and decisions, and you were supposed to help me with a lot of things, I said quietly. The words hung there, heavy with everything I wasn't saying. You were supposed to notice when I was sick. You were supposed to remember my coat. You were supposed to care if I ate dinner or walked home alone or slowly disappeared from your family like I'd never existed at all. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor too loud in the silence. I'm going upstairs, I said. I have homework. I left them sitting there with my acceptance letter on the table between them, proof of all the ways I'd learned to survive without them. The next few months were interesting in an anthropological way, like watching people suddenly realize their house was on fire after years of ignoring the smoke. They tried, in their awkward, belated, desperate way. Dad offered to help me pack, showed up at my door with empty boxes and tape. I was already mostly done, my belongings organised with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light emotionally. I've got it, I told him. But thanks. He stood there in the doorway, this man who'd given me life but forgot to give me attention, and I could see him trying to find words for things he'd never learned to say. I'm proud of you, he finally managed. Full scholarship. That's really something. Thanks, I said, and I meant it, even though the pride came too late to heal anything. Mum suggested a family dinner to celebrate, wanted to make reservations at that nice Italian place downtown. I declined politely. "I'm celebrating with Mrs. Chen," I said. "She's taking me out for Chinese food." Mum flinched like I'd hit her. "We're your family, Sienna." "Mrs. Chen remembered my chemistry presentation," I said simply. "She asked me how it went. She knew it was important." I didn't say that Mum had been at Olivia's soccer game that same day, that she'd never asked about my presentation, that Mrs. Chen had been more of a mother to me in 6 months of babysitting than Mum had been in 6 years of living under the same roof. I didn't need to say it. Mum's face told me she understood. Olivia wanted to go shopping for dorm supplies together, tried to make it into a sister bonding thing. She showed up at my door with car keys and a hopeful smile. "Come on," she said. "We can make a day of it. Get lunch, do our nails after." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the golden child who'd stolen my parents' love, but a girl who'd never had to notice anyone but herself. She wasn't malicious. She was just oblivious. And that somehow made it worse. "I already ordered what I need online," I told her. "It's being delivered next week." "Oh." Her face fell. "I just thought, we haven't spent much time together lately." "We've never spent time together, Olivia. You've just started noticing." She flinched, and I felt a small, petty satisfaction that I wasn't proud of, but couldn't quite regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," I said, and closed the door gently but firmly in her face. But I noticed something else happening too, a subtle shift in the household dynamics. They looked at me differently now, like I was a guest who'd announced her departure and suddenly become visible. They noticed when I came and went. They asked about my day. They tried to include me in conversations. It was too little and far too late, but it was something. One evening in May, about 3 weeks before I was set to leave, I found Mum sitting in the kitchen with my coat, the one from the bus stop, the one I'd abandoned in my closet, spread across her lap. She was smoothing the fabric with her hands over and over, like a prayer or a penance. "I never apologised for this," she said without looking up. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "No, you didn't." "I should have. I should have done a lot of things differently." Her hands kept moving, kept smoothing. "I should have noticed when you stopped eating dinner with us. Should have asked why you were always in your room. Should have remembered that you needed things too." I waited. I'd learned that silence was its own kind of power, that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "I thought..." She finally looked up at me, and her eyes were red. "I thought you were fine. You were always so independent, so capable. You never asked for help or complained or seemed to need us. Olivia needed more help, more attention, more guidance, and you seemed like you had everything handled." "I was 14, Mum." My voice came out flatter than I intended. 14-year-olds shouldn't have to beg their parents to notice them. "I know." Her voice cracked like ice breaking. "I know that now." I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but something softer than the ice I'd been carrying. She was trying, even if it was too late, even if it couldn't change what had already happened, even if all her trying couldn't bring back the daughter who died alone waiting for them to care. "I'm still leaving," I said. "I know. And I'm still angry." "I know that too." We stood there in the kitchen, the coat between us like evitable evidence in a trial that was already over, verdict already delivered. "Maybe someday it'll be different," I offered, and it was the closest thing to kindness I could manage. "But right now, I need to go. I need to be somewhere I'm not invisible. Somewhere I don't have to freeze waiting for people to remember I exist." She nodded, crying quietly now, tears dripping onto the coat in her lap. "You were never invisible, Sienna. We weren't looking. We weren't paying attention. And I don't know how to forgive myself for that." "You'll figure it out," I said. That's not my responsibility. It was the truth, hard and sharp, but necessary. I'd spent too many years taking responsibility for their failures, making excuses for why they forgot me, convincing myself that I just needed to try harder to be worth remembering. I was done with that. The day I left for college, they all came to the airport. Dad loaded my bags into the car with careful precision, like he could make up for everything by handling my luggage correctly. Mum kept checking her phone for flight updates, determined not to miss a single detail now that it was too late to matter for anything that came before. Olivia cried the whole drive, big, messy sobs that made her mascara run. At the departure terminal, she threw her arms around me and held on like she was drowning. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying, over and over like an incantation. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I wasn't a better sister." I hugged her back because she was still my sister, even if we'd never really been sisters in any way that mattered. "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't change anything." Dad slipped an envelope into my bag when he thought I wasn't looking. Money, I found out later, more than I expected, less than I deserved, but a gesture nonetheless. He hugged me awkwardly, his hands hovering like he wasn't sure he had permission to touch me. "You call if you need anything," he said. "Anything at all." I nodded, but didn't promise. Mum held my face in her hands like she used to when I was little, before Olivia was born and I was still her only child, still special, still seen. "Call me," she said, and her voice was desperate. "Please, even if you're still angry, even if you hate me, just let me know you're okay." "Maybe," I said. I didn't promise anything I couldn't keep. I'd learned that promises were just words people used when they wanted to feel better about themselves, and I was done making other people feel better at my own expense. The plane lifted off, and I watched the city shrink beneath me, the house where I died in one life and survived in another, getting smaller and smaller until it was just another set of lights in the dark. I felt my chest expand with something that wasn't quite joy, but was close. Relief, maybe, or freedom, or just the simple satisfaction of knowing I'd saved it myself when nobody else would. I felt lighter than I had in years. At school, I was nobody's forgotten daughter. I was just Sienna, a girl who worked hard, made friends slowly and carefully, and built a life where people saw her because she'd learned to see herself first. My roommate was a girl named Maya, who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. My professors learned my name within the first week. People noticed when I was absent, asked if I was okay when I seemed quiet, remembered things I told them. It was revolutionary being remembered. The calls home started awkward and stayed that way for a long time. Mum tried too hard, her voice too bright, her questions too numerous, like she could make up for years of silence with an avalanche of interest now. Dad asked surface-level questions about classes and weather, safe topics that didn't require real vulnerability. Olivia sent long texts about missing me, about understanding now what she'd never noticed before, about how empty the house felt without me. I responded when I felt like it, not to punish them, but because I'd learned that my time and energy were mine to give, not debts I owed for the sin of being born into their family. I'd learned that I didn't have to make myself available just because they'd suddenly decided I was worth their attention. Slowly, over months and then years, something new grew in the space where obligation used to live. It wasn't the relationship I'd wanted as a kid. That was gone, buried with the girl who'd died waiting at a bus stop for a coat that never came. But it was honest. They didn't pretend they'd been good parents. I didn't pretend I'd forgiven them. We existed in this strange new dynamic where everyone acknowledged the truth, and somehow that made room for something real to grow. Mum called on my 18th birthday, not to sing or celebrate, but to say something she'd clearly been practicing. I still have your coat. She said quietly. The one from the bus stop. I kept it. Why? To remember. To make sure I never forget again what it cost you when we did. I thought about that coat, about standing in the cold, about all the ways I tried to make myself smaller so they wouldn't forget me, only to become so small I disappeared entirely. You can donate it, I said after a long pause. Some other kid might need it. Are you sure? I'm sure. I don't need it anymore. I bought my own coat. I learned to keep myself warm. There was silence on the line, and I could hear her breathing, could imagine her holding that coat like it was precious. I'm proud of you, she finally said. Not just for the scholarship or the grades or getting into such a good school. I'm proud of you for saving yourself when we failed you. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. The last time I went home, really home, not just visiting but feeling like I belonged even a little, was Thanksgiving of my junior year. I'd been away for 3 years by then, had built a whole life in another state, had learned who I was when I wasn't trying to be visible to people who refused to see. The house looked the same, but we were all different. They'd learned to ask instead of assume. I'd learned that leaving didn't mean I had to disappear completely, that I could come back without losing myself. We sat around the dinner table, and for the first time in years, I stayed for the whole meal, not because I needed their approval or craved their attention, not because I was afraid of being forgotten or desperate to be seen. I stayed because I chose to, because the girl who died alone had taught the woman I became something crucial. You can't make people love you the way you need, but you can love yourself enough to walk away from their cold. And sometimes, if you're lucky and they're willing to do the work, they learn to follow you into the warmth. Mum passed the potatoes without being asked. Dad mentioned my latest research project at school with actual pride and correct details. He'd remembered, had written it down. Olivia asked about my life with genuine interest, not competition, sharing her own college struggles without making them a performance. It wasn't perfect. We'd never get back what we'd lost. The years I'd spent invisible, the loneliness, the dying alone, those were scars that wouldn't fade completely. But it was enough. After dinner, I went up to my old room out of curiosity more than nostalgia. Someone had been keeping it clean. The bed made with fresh sheets, the curtains washed, my books dusted. On my desk sat a framed photo I'd never seen before. Me, at 16, standing at the bus stop in December, arms wrapped around myself against the cold. I was small in the frame, hunched against the wind, and my face held that resigned expression I'd worn for months before I died. Mum must have taken it from the car that day, the moment before she drove past. I picked up the frame, studied that girl's face. She looked so small, so forgotten, so resigned to her invisibility. I set it back down gently, my fingers lingering on the frame. I remember you, I whispered to that girl in the photo. I remember how cold you were, how alone, how much it hurt to be invisible. And I promise, I'll never let anyone make me that cold again. Then I turned off the light and went back downstairs, where it was warm, where my family was trying in their imperfect way, where I'd learned that the best revenge isn't making them hurt the way they hurt you. It's refusing to freeze while waiting for their love. The real victory was in the leaving, in the choosing, in the building of a life so warm and full that their coldness couldn't touch it anymore. The victory was in becoming someone who knew her own worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. I'd died in the cold once, alone and unnoticed and unmourned. I'd never wait in it again.